The astral bastion of Veriex drifted above a dead sun like the skull of some forgotten god. Vast walls of black iron enclosed its continent-sized foundations, while cathedral spires pierced the void beneath fields of dim blue energy that crackled endlessly against the vacuum. Pilgrim fleets crawled around the fortress world in silent processions, their engines glowing like funeral candles within the dark. For 10,000 years, the bastion had guarded the northern reaches of the Empire's stellar dominion, and for 10,000 years its priests had preached that nothing beyond the veil of stars could be trusted. Yet even within that age of fear, rumors spread faster than decree. They whispered of a man whose eyes were forever hidden beneath strips of pale cloth, a warrior untouched by prophecy, a soul that the sacred augurs could neither measure nor contain. The lower pilgrims called him the Blind King. The high clergy called him a threat. Satyr Gojo arrived aboard no royal vessel. His transport descended alone through the bastion's ash-choked atmosphere, cutting through storms of frozen dust before settling upon the processional causeway where statues of ancient martyrs towered over kneeling crowds. Millions watched in silence as the craft's gate unfolded. From the shadows emerged a tall figure draped in a dark military mantle. White hair stirred in the windless cold. Cloth covered his eyes, though his steps carried no uncertainty. He walked with the ease of a man crossing familiar ground, despite entering a fortress older than many civilizations. Armed sentinels lined the path ahead of him. Bronze-faced soldiers carrying halberds engraved with prayer scripts tightened their grip as he approached. Their commander, Marshal Edric Vale, descended the stone stairway to greet him. Vale had witnessed planetary purges. He had ordered moons burned from orbit, yet the stranger before him unsettled him more deeply than war ever had. "State your allegiance," Vale demanded. Gojo tilted his head slightly, amused by something invisible. "To the living, when they deserve it." The answer echoed strangely beneath the immense arches overhead. Vale studied him carefully. No psychic halo shimmered around the man. No machine familiar scanned within his flesh, yet every instinct screamed caution. The air itself seemed distorted around him, as though reality resisted drawing near. "You were summoned by the Synod," Vale said at last. "The High Oracles await judgment." "Judgment?" Gojo smiled faintly. "That sounds dramatic." Without waiting for permission, he continued forward. The soldiers moved instinctively to block him. None reached him. Their halberds halted inches from his body as though striking unseen glass. Sparks burst from frozen air. Metal trembled violently against a force neither visible nor understood. Panic flashed across the soldiers' faces as they strained harder, yet the distance between blade and flesh remained absolute. Gojo walked between them effortlessly. Not one weapon touched him. The watching pilgrims fell to their knees in terror. Far above the causeway, hidden behind stained crystal windows, the Synod observed everything. 12 high priests sat upon iron thrones connected to great machines that drank directly from their nervous systems. Tubes carried black fluids through their ancient bodies while thousands of candles burned across the chamber floor. Beneath murals depicting mankind's eternal war against the unseen abyss. At the chamber's center stood the Grand Oracle Seraphil, oldest among them. His mechanical eyes rotated slowly toward the image feed, displaying Gojo's arrival. "He disrupts causality itself," one priest whispered. "No psychic signature," muttered another. "Impossible." Seraphil remained silent. For decades, the Empire's sacred diviners had foreseen a convergence approaching from beyond the veil. Entire choirs of sanctioned seers had clawed their own eyes out after glimpsing it. Fleets vanished near the northern, dark. Astropathic messages arrived soaked in madness and blood. And always, within fragmented visions, appeared the same figure. A blind man standing before dead stars. "Bring him below," Seraphil commanded quietly. Deep beneath the bastion, beneath the cathedrals and weapon foundries and prison crypts, lay the hall of silent astronomy. Few living souls knew it existed. Even fewer entered willingly. Gojo descended through its colossal corridors accompanied by Marshal Vale and hundreds of armed guards. The walls were carved with equations written in extinct tongues. Ancient mechanisms groaned within the depths like sleeping beasts. Somewhere far below, unseen choirs chanted without pause. "You built all this to protect yourselves from fear," Gojo said suddenly. Vale frowned. You know nothing of the abyss. No, Gojo replied softly. I know too much. They reached the final gate. 30 meters high, forged from silver-black stone, the doors bore a single symbol, an empty circle surrounded by screaming faces. Vale hesitated before opening it. Even he disliked this chamber. The hall beyond resembled a cosmic tomb. Countless star maps drifted through the darkness as projections of dying galaxies rotated overhead. At the center stood a throne carved from pale crystal, and upon that throne rested a figure bound in chains of gold. The prisoner appeared neither alive nor dead. Its skin was translucent. Veins glowed faintly beneath flesh like rivers of cold fire. Most horrifying of all were its eyes, sewn shut with silver thread. Gojo stopped walking. For the first time since entering the bastion, his expression lost its playful calm. What is that? He asked. Marshal Vale answered carefully. 3 centuries ago, our crusaders discovered it drifting within a coffin ship beyond the Halo reach. Entire crews slaughtered themselves after hearing its voice. We sealed it here beneath 13 sanctified barriers. The chained figure twitched. The temperature in the chamber plummeted instantly. A distant whisper spread through the darkness. Not sound. Thought. Gojo heard screaming oceans. Burning worlds. Choirs chanting in languages older than humanity itself. He saw enormous shapes moving behind reality like predators beneath black water, and something beyond those visions noticed him in return. The sewn-shut eyes of the prisoner slowly turned toward Gojo despite remaining sealed. Then every star map in the chamber went dark at once. The silence that followed felt alive. Far beyond Verix, beyond the edges of mortal navigation, something ancient shifted within the endless veil between dimensions. And for the first time in uncounted ages, the gods of ruin began to look back toward mankind. The silence that followed the collapse of the star maps did not end when Gojo turned away from the chained oracle. It lingered inside the hall of silent astronomy like a wound refusing to close. Marshal Vale ordered the chamber. Sealed, yet even as the silver-black gates descended, something beyond them had already awakened. Gojo walked upward through the descending corridors without looking back, while the priests above argued over whether the prisoner had truly reacted to him or merely reflected their fears. No consensus was reached, because consensus required certainty, and certainty was something the Bastion no longer possessed. That night, Gojo stood alone upon an outer observation balcony where fractured auroras shimmered across the dead sun's horizon. The wind there was artificial, generated by failing atmospheric engines older than the Empire itself, yet it carried something far more unnatural than machinery. Visions pressed against his perception again, fragmented echoes of the chained oracle, and behind it, shapes vast enough to erase the idea of distance. Far beneath him, within the Synod's hidden chamber, Seraphel convened emergency rites without awaiting approval from any surviving doctrine. The priests entered trance communion, linking their minds to forbidden astral currents, seeking confirmation that the anomaly was contained. Instead, they found the opposite. The currents were no longer stable, as though something had begun to rewrite the structure of psychic space around Verix. Within hours, the Bastion diverted its attention from Gojo's arrival toward an ancient emergency directive buried beneath planetary defense archives. It authorized the awakening of the Ice Moon's excavation choir, a forgotten cadre of psychic operatives sealed away after their last mission ended in mass cognitive collapse. Their task was simple in doctrine but impossible in truth: descend beneath the frozen satellites of Ver 9 and retrieve the source of the psychic disturbances. Gojo was not informed of their deployment, yet he felt their departure like a ripple through unseen dimensions. 3 days later, the expedition reached the Ice Moons. 3 shattered spheres locked in eternal orbit, their surfaces carved with impossible geometric scars. Beneath their frozen crusts lay oceans of black glass, and deeper still, structures that did not belong to any known civilization. As the excavation vessels breached the upper ice layer, every psychic aboard began to scream without sound, their minds synchronized into a single terrified note. Far below, within a cavern lit by pale bioluminescent fractures, the choir beneath the Ice Moons was waiting. They were not alive in any traditional sense. but composed of layered consciousnesses fused into crystalline resonance fields that hummed with borrowed memories of extinct stars. And within that impossible choir, something recognized Gojo's presence even across impossible distance, as if the concept of him had already been written into their collective dream. Back aboard the Bastion, Seraphel's body convulsed as the same resonance echoed through Imperial astropathic channels, corrupting every attempt to isolate it. Gojo, still on the observation balcony, finally lowered his head slightly, as though listening to something approaching from beyond thought itself. And far beneath the ice moons, the choir began to sing a pattern that had never been heard, only remembered by things that should not exist. The pattern rippled through space-time like an infection of meaning, distorting probability around the Bastion's defenses and causing entire orbital arrays to misalign without physical cause. Marshal Vale reported it as system failure, but even he no longer believed in such simple explanations. Gojo turned toward the horizon where the ice moons hung like broken teeth in a god's shattered mouth. For the first time since arriving at Ver 9, he moved with deliberate intent rather than idle curiosity. Because whatever had begun beneath the frozen moons was not merely calling to him, it was learning him. And in the depths of that impossible communion between choir and cosmos, something ancient stirred within the chaos-veiled boundary between thought and divinity. The ice moons answered by cracking open further, releasing waves of psychic sound that traveled backward through causality itself. Gojo's expression remained calm, yet the space around him bent as if reality was bracing for his decision. Far away, unseen by any imperial censor, the first whisper of the chaos gods slipped into alignment with the choir's song. And thus, beneath the frozen moons of Ver I, the boundary between mortal consciousness and infinite hunger began to dissolve. No alarms were raised in time, because the concept of warning itself was already being rewritten in the minds of those who should have spoken it. Gojo stepped forward at last, not as a savior nor as an invader, but as something the cosmos had not yet decided how to classify. And deep within the choir, a single unified thought emerged for the first time. Recognition without understanding. It waited. The echo of the choir beneath the ice moons did not fade when the transmission ceased. It followed Gojo back through the Bastion's layered defenses like a second shadow that did not belong to him, pressing against reality with patient insistence. Within the Synod's upper sanctum, every divination engine shattered in unison, their crystal cores fracturing as if struck by an invisible hand. Seraphel's attendants reported that the Hall of Silent Astronomy had begun to remember itself, replaying moments that had never occurred. The high oracles convened again, but this time none dared to sit upon their thrones. Marshal Vale attempted to maintain order, yet even his authority bent under the pressure of unseen interpretation. Records concerning Gojo multiplied and contradicted themselves. Some archives described him as human, others as absence shaped like man. When the Synod attempted classification through the sacred cognition lattice, the system returned only a single response: undefined sovereignty. It was then declared that Gojo Satoru could not be measured, and what could not be measured could not be permitted within imperial continuity. The decree was spoken without conviction, as though the chamber itself rejected its own conclusion. Yet containment required proximity, and proximity had already proven impossible since his arrival. Weapons failed, prayers dissolved, and even sanctioned null rites fractured upon contact with the field surrounding him. The priests called it heresy, the engineers called it physics without permission. Beneath their debate lay a deeper terror. Gojo did not resist the world. He simply existed outside its agreement. The Synod's hidden doctrine, preserved for centuries, spoke of entities that did not break reality but rewrote its assumption of limitation. Those entities were never meant to be encountered within imperial space. Far beyond the Bastion's perception lattice, something vast shifted its attention. Not a single intelligence, but a convergence of hungers that existed where meaning dissolved into appetite. Gojo felt it not as sight or sound, but as pressure upon the concept of observation itself. It was as though countless eyes had opened within the same impossible direction, none of them fully existing in the same reality. The Ice Moon's choir had acted as a signal, and now the signal had been received. What answered did not travel through space. It arrived by rewriting the necessity of distance. The Synod initiated the right of silent thrones, a forbidden protocol meant to erase perception of anomalies by denying them narrative existence. 12 void-crowned priests entered resonance chambers where thought itself was regulated by mechanical hymns. As they spoke, the null words, the bastion dimmed across entire sectors, as if memory were being physically drained from its architecture. Yet Gojo remained unaffected. Instead, the ritual recoiled inward, and 3 priests collapsed into recursive oblivion, repeating prayers that no longer referenced anything real. Marshal Vale escorted Gojo under reluctant command, though every step felt like betrayal of his own training. The corridors leading to the Synod chamber were lined with statues of blind saints, their faces carved without eyes to symbolize obedience to unseen law. Yet as Gojo passed, several statues turned subtly toward him despite their stone imprisonment. Vale noticed but did not speak, because speaking would have required acknowledging that something within the bastion had begun to perceive Gojo as more real than the bastion itself. When Gojo finally entered the Synod chamber, silence did not fall. It was imposed. The 12 thrones of the High Oracles stood empty for the first time in recorded history, as though refusing occupation. Seraphel remained bound in the lower archives, leaving only fragmented authority behind. The remaining priests observed Gojo not with eyes alone, but with instruments designed to interpret divine intention. Every instrument failed simultaneously. The chamber filled with the sound of systems refusing to acknowledge what stood before them. Above Vir Ix, the void between stars subtly tightened, like breath held in anticipation. The Chaos Gods, still without form or name within imperial understanding, regarded the anomaly that could neither be classified nor contained. In that regard lay invitation. Gojo felt it as pressure across infinity itself, a recognition that did not seek permission. The bastion's thrones remained silent, but something far greater had begun to lean inward toward them, drawn not by conquest, but by curiosity unrestrained by consequence. And for the first time, silence within the empire felt like the beginning of speech. The silence within the Synod chamber did not survive the widening fracture of the void above Veri, for something vast had already begun to descend along trajectories that ignored the meaning of orbit. Across the outer sensor rings, Imperial Void Watchers recorded impossible signatures, red stellar flares moving in synchronized procession, as if the sky itself had been taught to bleed in ordered rhythm. Marshal Vale reported the anomaly to the Synod, but the transmission broke halfway through his words, replaced by chanting that no human throat could have produced. Then the Crimson Pilgrims arrived. They came not as a fleet in the imperial sense, but as a moving theology of war, their vessels painted in coagulated crimson light that burned even in the vacuum between stars. Every hull bore sacred scars etched by self-inflicted plasma rites, and every engine pulse echoed like a war hymn remembered by something older than empire or god. They believed the blind king of Ver Ix was not a man, but the final vessel through which the long-dormant god of endless slaughter would awaken. Within their doctrine, suffering was not punishment but currency, and entire worlds had been burned to pay for the privilege of ascension. As their flagship breached Ver Ix's upper atmosphere, the sky turned the color of opened wounds, and the bastion's defense choirs began to scream without instruction. Gojo stood alone on the Synod balcony as crimson light spilled across the curvature of the world, his expression unchanged, even as reality itself seemed to recoil from the approaching armada. Marshal Vale drew his weapon instinctively, though he already understood it would not matter, far beyond perception. The chaos currents stirred in response to the pilgrims' belief, recognizing them not as invaders, but as offerings shaped by conviction. Gojo finally turned his head toward the descending fleet, and for the first time since arriving at Vir 9, something like anticipation touched the stillness around him. Below the descending armada, the oceans of Verix began to boil in unnatural geometries, as if the planet itself was attempting to interpret the meaning of their arrival. The Crimson Pilgrims broadcast no demand, no ultimatum, only a singular pulse of doctrinal affirmation that spread through the bastion's communication lattice like a disease of belief. Within that pulse, millions of imperial systems briefly synchronized, and for one fraction of a second, every listening mind saw the same image, a throne built from extinguished suns. Several synod priests collapsed immediately, their cognition unable to reconcile worship with annihilation presented as salvation. Gojo listened to the incoming transmission not with ears, but with the space around him bending subtly, as though reality itself translated intent into sensation. The first wave of crimson vessels entered orbital range, and their engines opened like ritual wounds, releasing thousands of smaller craft shaped like spear prayers. Each pilot had undergone ascension by pain, their bodies rewritten through sanctioned agony until identity itself became subordinate to doctrine. Marshal Vale ordered planetary defense activation, but every weapon system returned only a single status, unwilling. Gojo stepped forward onto the balcony edge, where gravity protocols weakened under the weight of approaching war. Far above, the Crimson Pilgrims began their hymn of arrival, a soundless resonance that tore through the concept of distance and replaced it with devotion. The Chaos Gods, still unnamed within Imperial doctrine, observed the hymn as something more than worship. It was recognition without understanding, and therefore infinitely dangerous. Within the warp beyond thought, pressure gathered like laughter held behind collapsing universes. Gojo's expression did not change, yet the space around his right hand distorted slightly, as though infinity itself was preparing to remember how to end. The Bastion's upper shields ignited as the Crimson Pilgrims initiated their descent ritual, converting fleet momentum into structured impact geometry. Entire segments of atmosphere fractured into luminous shards as the first pilgrimage vessels pierced the upper sky of Ver-Ix. In the Synod chamber, Seraphel's remaining attendants finally understood that containment had already failed, not through breach, but through reinterpretation of reality itself. Gojo looked upward as the sky split into crimson fractures, and the blind king of Ver-Is became the only fixed point in a falling universe. Below him, the Crimson Pilgrims committed their final doctrinal convergence, transforming their entire descending armada into a single unified invocation aimed not at destruction alone, but at awakening the entity they believed slept behind Ver-Ix's material veil. The Bastion's systems screamed as logic itself degraded into devotional mathematics, and even Marshal Vale found himself unable to distinguish between tactical reality and imposed scripture. Gojo remained still at the edge of the balcony, yet the air around him no longer obeyed even the concept of stillness. Far above, within the collapsing boundary between space and belief, something vast began to answer the pilgrim's call, and it was not yet decided whether it would arrive as God or consequence. The impact of the Crimson Pilgrims did not arrive as destruction alone, but as a doctrinal inversion that fractured the Bastion's upper skies into cascading bands of crimson scripture, across which reality bent and reformed under the weight of belief made material. Gojo stood at the balcony edge still, unmoved as the descending fleet completed its final interpretive descent and the Bastion's atmosphere ignited in structured collapse. The Crimson Pilgrims did not strike as soldiers but as an idea enforced by sacrifice, and their vessels folded inward into ritual geometry as they attempted to align Ver-9 with their doctrine of awakening through suffering. Below them, the planetary crust responded not with resistance, but with opening great fissures spread across continents, revealing what had been hidden beneath Imperial history. Gojo turned away from the sky at last and began walking. Marshal Vale followed reluctantly, though every instinct demanded he remain to witness the collapse of orbital defense logic. The Synod chamber behind them trembled as Seraphel's remaining attendants attempted to stabilize the cognition lattice, but every attempt returned only recursive nullification. Gojo spoke without turning his voice calm beneath the collapsing sky. Something below is calling not the pilgrims, something older. Vale tightened his grip on his weapon that has no name in any surviving registry. You speak as if you understand it. I understand patterns, Gojo replied. And patterns always repeat until they become something worse. Far beneath the Bastion, the ice moon resonance still lingered like a memory refusing to die, and that memory now intersected with the pilgrim's descending hymn. Two songs were colliding across the same impossible medium belief made soundless reality. The ground beneath Ver-Ix split open without explosion, revealing a vertical descent that had no measurable end, only darkness structured like architecture. Ancient stairways of black stone, emerged as if the planet had been built around something rather than formed naturally. Vale whispered, "This was never a fortress world." Gojo stepped toward the opening without hesitation. The air inside the fissure carried no temperature, only absence of expectation. They descended. The deeper they went, the more the bastion above ceased to feel like a structure and instead became a distant concept. Sound itself began to detach from matter, leaving only resonance without source. And then they saw it, the city that forgot the sun. It stretched infinitely downward, a subterranean empire, carved into layered abyssal strata, each level illuminated by pale luminescence, not of light, but of memory fossilized into atmosphere. Buildings rose like inverted cathedrals, their spires pointing toward the surface that no longer mattered. Millions lived within its depths, though none looked upward because upward had ceased to exist as meaning. Gojo paused for the first time since arrival. Marshal Vale stared in disbelief. "This is impossible. No records, no detection, nothing." Gojo replied quietly, "That is why it survived." Below them, the city shifted, as if aware of observation. Figures moved through streets without shadows, their eyes dim like extinguished stars. And then the choir's echo returned, but altered, refined into something structured and intelligent. Gojo exhaled slightly, so it learned from the pilgrims. Vale asked, "Learned what?" Gojo looked into the endless descent of the city below, and answered simply, "How to remember without stars." At that moment, the city lights dimmed in sequence, as though something vast had passed through its collective cognition. The inhabitants stopped moving simultaneously, and every forgotten sunless structure aligned toward Gojo and the marshal, not as worship but as recognition of disturbance. Deep within the lowest strata, something opened that was not a door, but an agreement between reality and intrusion. Gojo felt it immediately, the same pressure as before, but inverted, as if the chaos beyond the veil had found a reflection beneath the world instead of above it. Vale stepped back instinctively. "We should return to the bastion." Gojo did not move yet, said, "No, we are already inside its mistake, and far beyond the city." That forgot the sun, something vast in the warp, finally responded, not with arrival, but with recognition. And the first fracture of meaning began to split open between worlds, like a breath taken inside a god that had just learned fear. The city beneath them shuddered once more, and its sunless depths began to resonate with something that did not belong to any empire or doctrine, but to the silent spaces between thought and hunger. Gojo raised his hand slightly, not in attack, but in acknowledgement, and the city that forgot the sun responded by remembering something it was never meant to know. And deep within its endless descent a presence stirred that had been waiting since the first star went dark. It did not speak, but the idea of speech formed itself in every level of the city at once, as Gojo and Vale stood at the edge of the descending abyss, realizing that what they had entered was not a hidden world, but a waiting one. The city that forgot the sun remained motionless after its recognition of Gojo, yet the stillness was not peace. It resembled anticipation stretched across impossible depth, as though the subterranean world beneath Varings had waited centuries for a disturbance capable of altering its dormant equilibrium. Marshal Vale could no longer distinguish architecture from intention. Entire districts shifted, subtly when unobserved, and the pale luminescence filling the abyssal avenues pulsed in rhythms too deliberate to be natural. Above them, far beyond the buried city, the crimson pilgrims continued their planetary descent, but their hymn had begun to fracture into discordant layers, as if another influence now competed for dominion over the same spiritual current. Gojo continued deeper into the city without hesitation. The inhabitants parted before him in absolute silence, their hollow eyes reflecting neither fear nor reverence. They appeared human only at a distance. Closer inspection revealed alterations impossible to explain through biology alone. Faces that subtly changed structure between moments, skin carrying faint traces of other identities beneath the surface, and mouths that moved soundlessly even while closed. Vale realized with growing horror that the citizens were not individuals in the traditional sense. They were accumulations, layered personalities fused into singular vessels over generations of ritual inheritance. At the city's central descent stood a colossal gate formed from mirrored obsidian, Thousands of faces drifted faintly across its surface like memories trapped beneath black water. As Gojo approached, the gate opened inward without physical movement, folding space itself into a corridor illuminated by crimson lanterns that burned without flame. Warm music echoed through the passage ahead, impossibly gentle after the cosmic dread-consuming Verix. Vale reached for his weapon again. This place was waiting for us. No, Gojo replied softly. It was waiting for permission. The corridor opened into an immense ceremonial hall hidden beneath the deepest layer of the forgotten city. Vast banquet tables stretched beyond visible distance, covered in silver vessels overflowing with impossible delicacies that shifted appearance whenever directly examined. Pale aristocrats sat motionless along both sides of the endless feast, their garments woven from living silk that moved like breathing skin. Every guest wore a different face, yet no face remained stable for long. Features melted gracefully into new configurations with every blink, as though identity itself were merely decoration. At the far end of the hall stood a towering figure draped in white and crimson robes. Its own face changed constantly between beauty and ruin, youth and decay, male and female, human and something beyond all recognizable categories. Yet despite the endless transformations, its smile remained constant. The figure bowed elegantly toward Gojo. The blind king enters at last. Its voice carried through the chamber not as sound, but as sensation directly interpreted by the nervous system. The aristocrats surrounding the banquet lowered their heads simultaneously, and the hall itself seemed to inhale. Vale whispered, "What are they?" Gojo studied the shifting figure calmly. "Hungry." The entity laughed softly, and several nearby guests convulsed in visible ecstasy merely from hearing it. Such a limited word for transcendence. The Feast of Endless Faces had once been a noble lineage within the ancient empire, long before Ver9 became fortress world and prison alike. They had sought immortality not through machinery or conquest, but through sensation refined beyond mortal boundary. Every experience was sacred, every desire was doctrine. Through rituals hidden beneath the forgotten city, they learned to absorb fragments of consciousness from one another, layering identities endlessly until individuality became obsolete. Now they existed as a collective aristocracy of consumption, feeding upon emotion, memory, pain, beauty, terror, and worship alike, and they desired Gojo more than any being they had encountered in their endless descent. "You stand beyond ordinary limitation," the shifting host said. "A soul untouched by causality, an emptiness even the gods observe with fascination." The mirrored walls surrounding the feast rippled slowly. Within them appeared fragmented visions of the chaos beyond reality, crimson wars without end, gardens of celestial decay, labyrinths woven from lies, and impossible palaces where desire itself became architecture. Vale felt his mind weaken merely witnessing them, yet Gojo remained unmoved. The host stepped closer. "Join us," it whispered. "Not as prey, as completion." For a moment the chamber fell entirely still. Then every face in the banquet hall turned toward Gojo simultaneously. Thousands of shifting identities aligned into singular expectation. The city above resonated in harmony with the feast, while far beyond Verix the chaos gods themselves seemed to pause in observation. Gojo smiled faintly beneath the cloth covering his eyes. "You misunderstand something," he said. The air around him distorted. The banquet tables trembled violently as invisible pressure spread through the hall like the approach of cosmic collapse. Silver vessels shattered. Mirrors cracked across impossible distances. Several aristocrats screamed as their layered identities destabilized instantly, faces melting uncontrollably between stolen forms. The host's smile faltered for the first time. Gojo took one slow step forward. "You think emptiness means hunger?" The pressure intensified. Entire sections of the ceremonial hall began folding inward as reality struggled to maintain continuity around him. The feast recoiled instinctively, not from attack, but from the realization that Gojo possessed something their endless consumption could never imitate: absence without need. And deep within the shifting corridors of the forgotten city, something older than the feast awakened in response to that revelation, recognizing within Gojo a silence even the chaos gods could not easily devour. The collapse of the Feast of Endless Faces did not end with shattered mirrors and unraveling identities. Its failure spread upward through the forgotten city like a fracture in the foundation of belief itself. Entire districts beneath Ver Ix dimmed into silence as the aristocratic collective retreated from Gojo's presence, their endless hunger finally encountering something that could not be consumed, imitated, or folded into shared sensation. Yet the withdrawal of the feast left behind a vacuum, and in the grim architecture of the cosmos, vacuums never remained empty for long. Far above the buried city, the Crimson Pilgrims continued their descent upon Ver Ix, though their hymn no longer sounded triumphant. Their fleet formations had begun to decay into asymmetrical patterns, and countless vessels drifted without command, as though unseen contamination had entered their sacred communion. Across the void, reports spread through fractured astropathic channels of entire worlds falling silent without battle. Planetary populations ceased responding. Harvest moons stopped transmitting. Pilgrim outposts were discovered untouched, yet entirely devoid of sane life. The plague arrived not through infection alone, but through recognition. Marshal Vale first saw its effect upon the lower sanctum guards stationed near the subterranean fissures. Their armor had fused partially into flesh, yet they neither screamed nor resisted. Pale fungal growths bloomed softly across their bodies like gardens cultivated in sacred patience. The afflicted soldiers stood together in absolute stillness, gazing upward with expressions of profound peace, while spores drifted slowly from their mouths into the cold air. One of them turned toward Vale and whispered gently, "The stars are finally resting." Then his body collapsed inward into wet ash and flowering decay. Gojo observed the remains without visible reaction, though the space around him tightened slightly as if infinity itself recognized a familiar intrusion. Deep within the warp beyond material reality, another chaos current had begun extending toward Ver Ix. Unlike the violent hunger of the Crimson Pilgrims or the consuming ecstasy of the feast, this presence moved with unbearable patience. It did not conquer, it accepted. Entire civilizations vanished beneath its embrace without resistance, because resistance itself slowly lost meaning. The Garden of Rotting Stars was spreading. Imperial archives described it only through fragmented extinction records. Systems touched by the garden did not die immediately. They transformed. Crops grew endlessly from corpses. Oceans thickened into living membranes beneath skies of fungal constellations. The afflicted ceased fearing mortality because mortality itself became cyclical, folded into eternal biological renewal. The plague granted continuity without life and immortality without selfhood. And now its source had noticed Gojo. The subterranean city trembled as vast root-like structures erupted through ancient stone, splitting entire districts apart. Towers that had stood hidden for millennia became wrapped in pulsating organic masses resembling planetary nervous systems. Pale spores drifted across the abyssal avenues in luminous clouds, and wherever they settled, the inhabitants of the forgotten city ceased moving altogether. Vale covered his mouth instinctively. "We need quarantine protocols." "There's nothing left to quarantine," Gojo replied quietly. Far below them, the lowest levels of the city opened into an impossible void where gravity weakened beneath layers of biological overgrowth. What had once been architecture now resembled a colossal garden cultivated by something incapable of understanding the boundary between flesh and environment. Giant flowers composed of translucent skin bloomed slowly in darkness, each containing faces suspended within their petals, dreaming peacefully despite obvious death. At the center of the abyss stood a tree, not a natural organism, but a structure woven from spinal columns, black roots, and fossilized stars embedded within bark-like tissue. Its branches stretched impossibly upward through layers of the forgotten city toward the surface of Ver Ix itself. Pulses of sickly green luminescence flowed through it, like blood, and beneath the tree sat a figure laughing softly. The entity appeared ancient beyond comprehension. Its massive body overflowed the throne of roots supporting it, while robes composed of living decay dragged endlessly across the ground. Countless small creatures crawled joyfully across its flesh, nesting within wounds that never closed. Yet its eyes radiated something far more terrifying than malice. Compassion. The laughter spread through the abyss gently, warmly, like the sound of an old friend welcoming weary travelers home. You carry such loneliness, the figure said to Gojo. Its voice entered thought directly, bypassing sound entirely. Vale fell to one knee instantly as visions flooded his mind. Dead comrades returned smiling, ruined worlds blooming again beneath endless spring, pain dissolving into eternal stillness. Gojo alone remained unaffected. The entity's smile widened. Interesting. Around them, the garden expanded further, roots piercing deeper into the forgotten city while spores drifted upward toward the bastion above. Entire planetary sectors were already falling silent beneath the plague's reach. The Crimson Pilgrims, once heralds of slaughter, now burned their own vessels, trying desperately to contain contamination spreading through their fleets. Yet the laughing figure beneath the rotting tree showed no urgency, because to the garden, all things arrived eventually. You stand outside despair, the entity murmured to Gojo. Even the gods find that rare. Gojo looked upon the impossible garden calmly. And you hide fear behind kindness. For the first time the laughter stopped. The roots surrounding the abyss tightened violently. Across Ver Ix, millions of infected voices whispered the same phrase simultaneously, as though the planet itself had spoken through them. He sees the wound beneath the rot. And somewhere far beyond the veil of stars, another chaos god turned its attention toward the blind king of the astral bastion. The laughter beneath the rotting tree did not resume after Gojo's words. Instead, it fractured into a quiet, inward silence, as though the entity of the Garden of Rotting Stars had been forced to reconsider the shape of its own compassion. Across Ver 9, the fungal bloom halted its expansion for a single suspended moment. Spores hung motionless in the air like dust trapped inside a forgotten breath. Even the roots embedded within the abyssal city ceased their slow, patient growth, not in retreat, but in attention. Marshal Vale felt the pressure of that stillness more violently than any battlefield he had ever survived. It was not absence of sound, but absence of inevitability. The garden had always behaved as if its outcome was already decided. Now, for the first time, it hesitated. Gojo stepped closer to the throne of roots. The laughing figure beneath the tree tilted its head slightly, as though listening to something beyond perception. "Something approaches that is not shaped by me," it said softly. "That is uncommon. Far above them, beyond layers of stone, fungal growth, and buried history, the Crimson Pilgrim's fractured fleet continued its descent toward planetary completion. Yet their hymn had begun to distort beyond recognition. Entire sections of their armada reported visions of corridors where time looped backward, and battalions that had not yet been born. Their faith, once unified in purpose, now echoed with interference. The interference had a source. Deep within the forgotten city's lowest void, a seam in reality began to open. Not like a wound, but like a page turning in a book that had not yet been written. From that seam came no light, no sound, only structure forming itself from potential. The Garden of Rotting Stars recoiled instinctively, its roots tightening as though recognizing an intrusion into its dominion of inevitability. Gojo looked toward the opening with a stillness that preceded recognition. Vale whispered, "That is not part of this world." "No," Gojo answered. "It is part of what has not happened yet." The seam widened, and something stepped through. It did not arrive as a singular being at first, but as overlapping impressions of existence collapsing into one frame. Shelves of impossible geometry unfolded around it, suspended in midair without support or origin. Vast corridors of translucent architecture extended into directions that defied spatial agreement, each filled with drifting records, scrolls, crystals, and fragments of thought preserved before they could become reality. At the center of this impossible library stood the librarian of unborn futures. It wore no fixed form. Its shape shifted subtly with each moment of observation, reflecting not what it was, but what it might have been had different choices been made across countless unformed timelines. Its presence carried the quiet gravity of something that had read every ending before any beginning was permitted. When it spoke, the words did not travel through air, but through the concept of sequence itself. "Violation detected," it said calmly. The Garden of Rotting Stars responded immediately. Roots surged upward, attempting to entangle the intrusion, but they passed through the librarian as though it existed slightly ahead of causality. Spores disintegrated before reaching its presence, not burned or destroyed, but unmade retroactively. The librarian turned its attention toward Gojo. Designation uncertain, it continued. You persist outside indexed futures. Vale stepped back instinctively. Indexed? The librarian did not answer him. Its focus remained fixed on Gojo as if Vale were already accounted for in an equation that had reached conclusion. Within the bastion above, synod systems began collapsing into predictive paradox. Every attempt to model the new arrival resulted in contradictory outcomes. Entire probability engines overheated and dissolved into inert data ash. Seraphels, remaining attendants screamed as their cognition lattices began projecting futures that invalidated their own existence. The librarian raised one hand slightly. Behind it, countless shelves shifted. Each contained records of wars that had never occurred, empires that had never risen, and gods that had been prevented from thinking themselves into existence. You are an unresolved branch, it said to Gojo, a deviation without correction path. Gojo remained still. And you are here to correct me? No, the librarian replied. Correction is no longer possible. A silence spread through the abyss beneath the city, deeper than the garden's stillness, deeper than the feast's shattered consumption. Even the rotting tree seemed to withdraw its attention, as though, encountering a form of existence, it could not metabolize. The librarian stepped closer. The chaos currents have already observed you, it said. That observation will propagate. All unborn futures will begin adjusting around your presence. You are not an anomaly within the system. It paused, as if selecting the least unstable phrasing. You are the reason the system will no longer converge. Far above, the Crimson Pilgrims' descent faltered entirely. Their sacred geometry dissolved mid-flight as their future state predictions ceased aligning. Pilgrimage vessels hung suspended in atmospheric collapse, unable to decide what trajectory they were meant to fulfill. Gojo finally raised his hand slightly. Not in attack. In acknowledgement. The librarian of unborn futures tilted its shifting form as if recognizing an unexpected variable. And in that moment, across Verais and the spaces beyond it, every timeline that had ever considered Gojo Satoru as an outcome began to fracture simultaneously, splitting not into new futures, but into uncertainty itself. The Garden of Rotting Stars went silent, and for the first time, something within the librarian's endless archives could not be read. The silence left behind by the librarian of unborn futures did not fade so much as fracture into unstable layers of possibility, each one failing to fully establish itself before dissolving into contradiction. Across Verenine, reality no longer behaved as a single agreement. The Garden of Rotting Stars remained still, its roots suspended in hesitant awareness. The Crimson Pilgrims hung above the atmosphere like stalled judgment. Even the forgotten city beneath the planet's crust ceased its endless reconfiguration, as though every living system had been forced to pause at the edge of an unreadable equation. Marshal Vale felt it most sharply. Time itself no longer flowed with certainty. Moments repeated with subtle differences, and cause no longer guaranteed consequence. He looked toward Gojo, expecting explanation, but found none. Gojo simply observed the shifting instability as one might observe weather that refused to commit to form. Then the mirrors began to speak. It started within the Feast of Endless Faces' shattered remnants, where broken reflective surfaces still lined the ceremonial hall beneath the abyssal city. Each fragment, once used to store stolen identities, flickered faintly despite the collapse of the feast itself. Within those fragments, something new appeared, not faces this time, but absence shaped into reflection. The mirrors no longer showed what stood before them. They showed what had been excluded from standing there. Across the buried city, every reflective surface, obsidian gates, polished bone relics, liquid pools of fungal sheen, began to resonate in unison. The librarian of unborn futures remained motionless in the abyss, its shifting form subtly distorted, as if distant observation had begun to interfere with its coherence. Even the Garden of Rotting Stars stirred faintly, its compassion now uncertain, as though recognizing a competing intelligence that did not grow, consume, or calculate. Gojo turned his head slightly. "I see it," he said. Vale frowned. "See what?" Before Gojo could answer, every mirror within Verix aligned. Not physically, conceptually. And through that alignment, something looked back. The first reflection appeared in the cracked obsidian gate of the Forgotten City. It showed Gojo not as he stood, but as he might have existed if he had never arrived. The second appeared in the feast's fractured remnants, depicting worlds where all consumption had already completed itself, leaving only hollow perfection. The third emerged within the garden's rotting surfaces, showing endless cycles of healing that erased individuality entirely. Each reflection carried a different outcome, a different interpretation of existence, yet all of them shared one unsettling property: they were aware of being watched. Then the mirrors spoke as one. Recognition established. The voice was not sound. It was the agreement of surfaces that understood themselves as observers rather than passive reflections. Marshal Vale stepped back instinctively. "This is another intrusion." Gojo remained still. "No," he said quietly. "This one was already here." Across the abyssal city, every reflective surface began to bleed light inward rather than outward. The garden of rotting stars recoiled, its roots withdrawing as if avoiding contamination. The librarian of unborn futures, far below, paused its shifting analysis for the first time since emergence. Even the crimson pilgrims' suspended armada above Verai began to distort as their polished hulls caught reflections that did not belong to their own future. Trajectories. From every mirror across existence, something began to assemble, not entering reality, assembling it. The first coherent manifestation appeared within the central abyssal hall of the Forgotten City. A figure stepped out of a mirror that did not exist until the moment of exit. It wore no fixed shape, only layered reflections of possible authority, crowned, faceless, fractured, multiplied. Each step it took replaced the ground behind it with reflective surface, as though reality itself was becoming an extension of its presence. It stopped before Gojo. "You are misaligned," it said. Vale raised his weapon, though the gesture felt ceremonial rather than functional. "Identify yourself." The figure turned slightly toward him, and Vale saw his reflection within it, but altered, older, already erased in some futures. "I am what remains when observation becomes sovereignty," it replied. Gojo studied it calmly. "A god?" The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the limitation of the term. "God is what they call us when they do not understand the medium through which we speak." Behind it, mirrors across Verix continued to multiply its presence. Every reflection carried a fraction of its awareness, distributed through surfaces that now functioned as organs of perception. The garden of rotting stars attempted to intervene. Roots surged upward through the abyss. They passed through the mirrored entity without resistance. The entity did not acknowledge them. "They cannot bind me," it said softly, "because I do not exist where binding occurs." Gojo's expression remained unchanged, though the space around him tightened subtly once more, as if infinity itself had begun recalculating its assumptions. "What do you want?" he asked. The mirrored god looked at him directly. "Correction," it said. The librarian revealed deviation. The garden attempted assimilation. The feast sought consumption. All failed to resolve you. Therefore, you are no longer a variable within their systems. A pause. You are now the system's error. Across Verix, every mirror simultaneously darkened, and within that darkness, a final reflection appeared. Not Gojo, not Vale, not any known entity, but something vast and incomplete, as if reality itself had begun to recognize an approaching contradiction it could no longer visually contain. The god who spoke through mirrors stepped closer, and for the first time since the collapse of certainty began, Gojo's silence felt less like absence and more like anticipation of something that had already decided to speak back. The mirrored god did not retreat when Gojo's attention settled upon it. Instead, the darkness within every reflective surface across Verix deepened, as though the planet itself had been instructed to forget the concept of clarity. Marshal Vale felt his vision fragment into overlapping impressions of possible outcomes, each one ending in a different form of collapse. The god who spoke through mirrors remained fixed in place, Yet its presence expanded through every fractured reflection until there was no longer a single point from which it could be confronted. Then the sky above the buried city tore open in a direction that defied orbital logic. It did not resemble invasion, it resembled revelation imposed upon matter. Across the upper atmosphere of Ver-Ix, the Crimson Pilgrim suspended armada finally resumed movement, but not as coherent fleets. Their vessels split apart mid-formation not through destruction, but through transformation. Hulls softened into layered biological architecture, engines dissolving into pulsating organ systems that beat in rhythm with a sound no longer transmitted through space but through belief itself. Entire warships became living extensions of something vast arriving from beyond the cross. Veil, as if the pilgrims had ceased being a fleet and become instead a doorway. Gojo looked upward as the transformation cascaded. Veil whispered, "They are changing shape." "No," Gojo said quietly. "They are being redefined." From the fractured sky descended the first of the cathedrals. It did not fall like a structure. It unfolded like a living doctrine. Vast masses of flesh interwoven with stone-like memory and burning script expanded across atmospheric layers, each segment forming impossible geometry that suggested both architecture and organism simultaneously. Towers of sinew rose within cathedral frames, and bell structures formed from exposed bone resonated with hymns that altered the chemical behavior of the air itself. These were not constructions of worship. They were worship given physical consequence. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh descended upon Veri as if the planet had always been waiting to be occupied by something that did not distinguish between devotion and consumption. As the first cathedral made contact with the upper crust, the surface of the world responded like skin under pressure. Entire continents shifted inward. Oceans thickened into viscous membranes that began pulsing in synchrony with the descending hymns. Mountain ranges bent without fracture, reshaping into rib-like formations supporting the expansion of living sanctuaries. The planet itself was being incorporated into a theological organism that no longer required worshippers, only material to continue existing. Marshal Vale staggered backward. "This is not invasion. It is assimilation at planetary scale." Gojo's gaze remained fixed on the descending cathedrals. "It is belief without boundary." Within the abyssal city, the mirrored god's presence flickered for the first time, not weakened, but redirected. As though the cathedrals had introduced a competing principle of reality, the garden of rotting stars responded immediately, its roots tightening across subterranean layers in an attempt to resist the incoming transformation. Yet wherever its fungal dominion touched the descending flesh cathedral structures, it was not destroyed. It was absorbed into new symbolic function. Decay became ornamentation, rot became structural language. Far below, the librarian of unborn futures finally turned its attention upward. For the first time, its endless archives did not shift cleanly. Futures began to overlap, contradict, and merge. Cathedrals that should not coexist appeared layered within the same probability space. Entire timelines folded into each other as the infinite flesh imposed its presence not on space, but on all possible interpretations of space. The mirrored god stepped closer to Gojo again, its form now flickering between stability and distortion. "This is convergence failure," it said. Gojo replied calmly, "No, this is competition." Above them, a cathedral's interior began extending downward through the city itself, passing through stone, memory, and void alike. Within its descending mass were countless faces embedded in living walls, all chanting variations of the same thought: completion through embodiment. Vale fired instinctively at the approaching structure, but the energy dissolved into flesh without resistance, becoming part of the cathedral's expanding hymn. The mirrored god turned slightly, observing the transformation spreading across Ver-9. "The system fragments," it said. Gojo took one step forward. "And yet it continues," he replied. As if responding to his movement, the cathedrals of the infinite flesh adjusted their descent pattern, not toward domination alone, but toward alignment. The structures began orienting themselves around Gojo's position, as though his presence had become a gravitational constant within a collapsing theological system. Far above, within the warped void beyond reality, something vast stirred again. Not one god, but multiple interpretations of godhood, converging upon a single anomaly that refused classification. The mirrored god's voice lowered. "You are becoming the axis of contradiction," it said. Gojo's expression remained unchanged. Below them, the first cathedral fully integrated into the buried city, and the entire subterranean structure of Vaerins began to sing, no longer as separate systems but as one unified, flesh-bound cathedral expanding across planetary depth. And within that unified song, every faction, every plague, every reflection, every unborn future began to harmonize against itself. The world did not end. It began to worship in incompatible directions all at once. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh did not complete their descent so much as continue existing into Vaer 9, as though the distinction between arrival and presence had been erased. Across the buried city, every structure now participated in a singular, unstable hymn that no longer belonged to any faction or belief system. The mirrored god flickered within fractured surfaces, its form increasingly difficult to distinguish from the reflections it once commanded. Even the Garden of Rotting Stars had ceased expansion, not in defeat, but in recalibration, its compassion now uncertain in the face of competing forms of totality. Gojo stood at the convergence point where the abyssal city, the descending cathedrals, and the fractured reflection network all overlapped in a single unstable geometry of reality. Marshal Vale no longer attempted to classify events. His mind had reached the limit of interpretive continuity, where observation itself became indistinguishable from participation. He remained only because departure no longer had definable direction. Then the world stopped agreeing with itself. It began subtly. Distance lost consistency first. A single corridor extended into multiple contradictory versions of itself, each equally real, each leading to a different cathedral organ embedded within the planetary crust. Sound separated from source, then from meaning, until voices existed independently of those who spoke them. Finally, causality itself began to detach, leaving effects suspended without reliable origin. Gojo exhaled slightly. "This is the threshold," he said. Vale turned toward him. "Threshold of what?" Gojo did not answer immediately. The space around them had already begun thinning, as though reality were being stretched between incompatible states of existence. Beneath Vaer IX, the cathedrals of the infinite flesh reacted to this instability by ceasing expansion, and instead stabilizing into fixed resonant structures, anchoring themselves to the fractured logic of the planet like parasites, adapting to a failing host. The mirrored god appeared once more, but now its form was incomplete. Only fragments of its presence could be observed at any given moment, each fragment showing a different interpretation of its intent. "The convergence is failing," it repeated, though the statement now sounded less like observation and more like recognition of inevitability. Then the hollow between dimensions opened. It was not a rupture in space. It was the exposure of what existed when space no longer held agreement with itself. Between the cathedrals, the garden, the feast's remnants, the mirrored network, and the librarian's fractured archives, a region formed where none of these systems could fully assert dominance. It was not empty. It was unclaimed by definition. From this hollow came no entity at first, but pressure. A presence defined only by its incompatibility with structure. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh attempted to incorporate it into him, but the hymn dissolved upon contact. The Garden of Rotting Stars extended compassion toward it, but found no suffering to absorb. The mirrored god projected observation, but the hollow reflected nothing back. And within that absence, something began to speak without language. Gojo stepped forward into the boundary where existence failed to stabilize. Vale shouted, "Do not enter that space." Gojo's voice remained calm. "It is already inside us." The moment he crossed the threshold, reality ceased attempting to unify itself around a single principle. Instead, it split into layered contradictions that no longer required reconciliation. Within the hollow between dimensions, Vaer IX was no longer a planet. It was a set of overlapping interpretations of a planet, each governed by different rules of existence. Here, the chaos gods did not appear as forms or entities. They manifested as unresolved tendencies within structure itself. Violence without origin, desire without object, decay without end, manipulation without truth. Each pressure existed simultaneously, yet none could dominate the others, because dominance required shared reality. The librarian of unborn futures flickered at the edge of perception, its archives collapsing into mutually exclusive records. Unresolvable state detected, it transmitted, though the transmission itself fractured midway, becoming multiple contradictory messages. The mirrored god's presence destabilized further. Observation cannot persist here, it admitted, its voice scattering across infinite reflections that no longer aligned. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh ceased singing entirely, not in silence, but in fragmentation, each organ of worship producing a different interpretation of divinity that cancelled the others. Gojo stood at the center of the hollow, where no center should have existed, and for the first time since his arrival, he was not surrounded by competing realities. He was surrounded by the absence of their agreement. Marshal Vale could barely perceive him now. "What is happening to you?" Gojo looked forward into the hollow. "I am not changing," he said. "Everything else is stopping its agreement about me." Within the hollow between dimensions, something vast began to form. Not as a being, but as recognition attempting to stabilize across incompatible truths. The chaos currents, the garden, the cathedrals, the mirrors, the librarian. All systems attempted simultaneous interpretation of Gojo Satoru, and in doing so, began to collapse into contradiction. And from that contradiction, the first true fracture of the chaos gods began to open, not into reality, but into disagreement with each other over what reality even was. The hollow between dimensions did not close after Gojo entered it. Instead, it deepened, as though his presence had become the axis around which incompatible realities were forced to acknowledge each other without reconciliation. Marshal Vale remained at the threshold of that impossible space, his perception fragmenting into discontinuous impressions of Gojo standing in multiple positions at once, each one equally valid yet mutually exclusive. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh flickered across reality in unstable resonance, their hymns reduced to disjointed pulses that no longer formed a coherent theology. Even the mirrored god had ceased attempting singular expression, its presence scattered across fractured reflections that could no longer align into identity. Within the hollow, the chaos currents no longer moved as a unified pressure. They separated, not into forms, into principles that refused coexistence. The first throne manifested as a fracture of violence without origin. It did not rise from ground or void, but asserted itself as inevitability given shape. Around it, every concept of resistance inverted into consequence before action could define itself. The space around Gojo trembled as probability collapsed into preemptive destruction that never quite occurred, because occurrence required stability the throne refused to acknowledge. The second throne emerged as desire without object. It radiated an expanding emptiness that attempted to assign meaning to every perception within reach. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh reacted instinctively, trying to interpret it as extension of their doctrine, but their structures folded inward, unable to sustain longing that had nothing to consume. Vale felt his thoughts pulled toward unnamed wants that dissolved before recognition. The third throne formed from decay without end. It was not corruption of matter, but exhaustion of permanence itself. Within its influence, even the idea of restoration failed to hold shape. The Garden of Rotting Stars, once a competing doctrine of transformation, recoiled violently as its own logic was reflected back at it stripped of mercy. Growth and collapse became indistinguishable states. The fourth throne arrived as manipulation without truth. It did not conceal or lie. It removed the necessity for distinction between interpretation and reality. The mirrored god flickered violently across every reflective surface within range, but each reflection now produced alternative interpretations of its own intent that could no longer converge. Observation itself became unreliable as a foundation for existence. Together, the four thrones of ruin did not stand in opposition. They defined the limits of what opposition could mean. Gojo remained at their intersection. Marshal Vale's voice fractured across distance that no longer measured itself consistently. "They are not entities, they are conditions." Gojo nodded slightly. "They are what happens when a system stops agreeing on what failure looks like." The hollow between dimensions began to compress around the four thrones, but compression required a shared definition of space, and none existed here. Instead, each throne expanded into its own interpretation of dominance, creating overlapping sovereignties that cancelled each other's authority without resolution. From beyond them, the chaos gods attempted convergence. Yet convergence required unity of principle, and unity was no longer possible. The Librarian of Unborn Futures appeared briefly at the periphery of perception, but its archives now contained mutually exclusive accounts of its own observation. In some records, the four thrones consumed Gojo. In others, Gojo erased the concept of throne entirely. In others still, neither event could be determined because sequence had dissolved. The mirrored god spoke through fragmented reflections. "This is not balance," it said. "This is collapse of interpretive hierarchy." The cathedrals of the infinite flesh attempted one final harmonic assertion, but their hymn fractured mid-pattern into incompatible liturgies that undermined each other's existence. The Garden of Rotting Stars ceased all expansion entirely, its compassion rendered undefined, without a stable subject to embrace. Within the center of it all, Gojo finally moved. Not forward, not backward, but in a direction that none of the four thrones could fully register without invalidating their own definitions. For the first time since the chaos currents had observed him, they did not simply respond. They disagreed with themselves about what responding meant. And within that disagreement, the structure of the four thrones of ruin began to destabilize, not through destruction, but through the inability to remain a single concept across all realities at once. The four thrones of ruin did not collapse in any conventional sense, because collapse required a shared understanding of structure, and that shared understanding had already fractured beyond repair. Instead, each throne began to lose coherence with itself. Violence without origin failed to sustain a consistent definition of action. Desire without object ceased to distinguish longing from perception. Decay without end could no longer differentiate persistence from termination. Manipulation without truth lost the capacity to separate influence from observation. The hollow between dimensions became unstable, not through destruction, but through disagreement at the most fundamental level of existence. Within that instability, Gojo stood as the only persistent reference point, though even that persistence was no longer universally agreed upon. Marshal Vale could see him, yet could not confirm whether the sight was continuous or a sequence of unresolved impressions stitched together by failing cognition. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh flickered in and out of interpretive existence, their immense structures reduced to intermittent assertions of theology rather than stable architecture. The mirrored god fractured further, its reflections now incapable of acknowledging one another as parts of a unified source. Then the disagreement spread outward. The hollow between dimensions began bleeding into Verix itself. Across the buried city, reality lost its obligation to remain singular. Streets overlapped with their own histories, producing corridors where past and present coexisted without sequence. The Garden of Rotting Stars, already weakened by the Four Thrones contradiction, began to reassert itself in fragmented regions, its compassion now expressed in inconsistent forms that no longer agreed on whether preservation or dissolution constituted mercy. Above, the Crimson Pilgrim's remaining fleet fractured into divergent trajectories, each vessel following a different interpretation of their sacred descent, resulting in simultaneous arrival and non-arrival across multiple planetary layers. Far beneath all of it, the Librarian of Unborn Futures attempted to stabilize its archives, but found that every recorded outcome now generated incompatible counter-records. Its existence degraded into simultaneous states of certainty and revision, forcing it to pause all predictive activity for the first time since its emergence. Marshal Vale finally broke through the instability long enough to speak. "The world is splitting." Gojo's gaze remained fixed forward. "It is trying to decide what I am relative to it." Within the collapsing logic of the hollow, the Four Thrones of Ruin reasserted themselves once more, but no longer as coherent principles. They now manifested as competing interpretations of Gojo's existence, each attempting to redefine him in terms compatible with their own collapsed states. Yet, every attempt only intensified contradiction, feeding back into the system as recursive instability. And from that instability, something unprecedented began to form. Not a new throne, not a new god, but a horizon. The last horizon of mankind did not appear as structure or entity. It emerged as the point beyond which no interpretation could extend without dissolving into contradiction. It was not distant, it was absolute. Every system within Ver 9, every faction, every godlike presence, every conceptual force now oriented itself toward this singular boundary, not by choice, but by the collapse of alternative direction. Gojo sensed it immediately. "This is where they stop," he said quietly. Vale looked toward him. "Stop what?" "Becoming coherent," Gojo replied. "Across reality, the Chaos Gods, the Garden, the cathedrals, the mirrors, and the librarian all attempted to project influence beyond the emerging horizon. Each projection failed in different ways, but all failed nonetheless. The last horizon of mankind did not resist them. It simply marked the limit of their ability to agree upon what continuation meant. Within that limit, humanity itself, fragmented, buried, corrupted, and transformed, became visible as a single unresolved question rather than a species. Its future did not vanish, it ceased to converge, and Gojo stood precisely at the point where convergence ended. The hollow between dimensions stabilized for a single impossible moment, not through resolution, but through exhaustion of contradiction. And in that moment, every force that had gathered around Vering understood the same silent truth. Beyond the last horizon of mankind, there was no war left to continue, only definitions waiting to collapse into whatever Gojo chose not to become. The last horizon of mankind did not dissolve after its revelation. It persisted as a boundary that could no longer be ignored, even by forces that had never acknowledged limits. Within its presence, the four thrones of ruin ceased attempting reinterpretation, not because they were defeated, but because reinterpretation itself had lost coherence. Violence without origin no longer distinguished itself from silence without cause. Desire without object no longer differed from absence of desire. Decay without end, folded into stasis without definition, and manipulation without truth became indistinguishable from observation without subject. Across Ver 9, the collapse of interpretive hierarchy reached its final stage. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh no longer sang, nor did they remain silent. Both states occurred simultaneously in different unresolved regions of reality. The garden of rotting stars ceased to expand or recede, existing instead as contradictory expressions of preservation and dissolution layered upon the same spatial coordinates. The mirrored God fractured into countless reflections that no longer recognized the concept of a shared origin. Even the librarian of unborn futures suspended its archives entirely, as every possible record of continuation now generated incompatible negations of itself. Marshal Vale could no longer trust the continuity of his own perception. Gojo appeared stable only because instability had lost a reference point against which to define deviation. "Nothing is holding together," Vale said, though the sentence felt incomplete even as he spoke it, as if language itself resisted confirmation. Gojo stood at the edge of the horizon without stepping beyond it. "It is not breaking," he said. "It is finishing the idea of holding." Beyond the horizon, the chaos currents attempted one final convergence. They did not arrive as forms, nor as principles. Instead, they manifested as competing interpretations of faith itself, each asserting a different definition of what belief required in order to exist. Yet within the horizon, faith no longer guaranteed continuity between thought and consequence. Belief could no longer stabilize reality because reality no longer agreed on what belief referenced, and so even faith began to fracture. The four thrones of ruin flickered once more, but now their identities were no longer distinguishable from the systems that generated them. Violence became indistinguishable from anticipation of violence. Desire became indistinguishable from the memory of desire. Decay became indistinguishable from the refusal to define persistence. Manipulation became indistinguishable from the absence of stable observation. They no longer ruled or observed. They simply failed to unify. Within that failure, something unexpected emerged. Not resistance, not collapse, but infinity at the end of faith. It was not a structure, nor an entity, nor a principle that could be described without contradiction. It was the condition that remained after every attempt to define meaning beyond the horizon had exhausted itself. Across Varix, all systems, biological, theological, mechanical, and conceptual, began to align not through harmony, but through shared inability to proceed. Gojo felt it most clearly. The space around him did not expand or contract. It simply ceased agreeing on whether expansion or contraction applied. Marshal Vale stepped back, voice trembling with fractured perception. If this is infinity, then nothing can move past it. Gojo did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed beyond the horizon, where even chaos could no longer maintain consistent self-reference. "No," he said finally, "it is not preventing movement." A pause, deeper than silence. It is what remains when even faith stops deciding where anything is going. Within that realization, the Chaos Gods did not retreat. They did not advance. They ceased to maintain unified intention. Across the warp beyond the veil, their presence dissolved into competing contradictions that could no longer be attributed to a single will. And at the center of Ver9, Gojo stood within infinity at the end of faith. Not as a conqueror, not as a vessel, but as the point where even belief itself had lost the authority to conclude what he was becoming. And for the first time since the War of Gods began, nothing demanded resolution. Infinity at the end of faith did not collapse when Gojo ceased to move within it. Instead, it stabilized into a condition that could no longer be meaningfully described as an event. Across Ver, IX, every system that had once struggled to interpret his presence now settled into a shared inability to continue interpretation at all. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh no longer generated hymns or counter-hymns. The Garden of Rotting Stars no longer distinguished growth from decay. The mirrored god no longer reflected anything that could be confirmed as origin. Even the Librarian of Unborn Futures remained suspended in unresolved recursion, its archives neither active nor erased, but indefinitely uncompiled. Marshal Vale stood at what remained of the abyssal convergence point, though the concept of point had already begun to degrade. Distances were no longer reliable, direction no longer guaranteed consequence. Yet Gojo remained perceivable, not because perception was stable, but because he had become the last consistent reference against which inconsistency failed to reorganize itself. "The war should have ended," Vale said quietly, though the sentence no longer carried the structure of certainty. Gojo looked toward the fractured horizon where the chaos currents had once attempted convergence. "It did not end," he replied. "It stopped agreeing with itself." Beyond Varix, within the regions that once belonged to the Chaos Gods, no singular presence remained capable of maintaining unified intent. What had once been interpreted as gods of excess, decay, manipulation, and violence now existed only as overlapping failures of definition. They did not vanish. They ceased to converge into identity. Even memory of them became unstable, fragmenting across incompatible accounts of what they had been. Within the silence after the stars, the warp itself no longer behaved as a medium of movement or corruption. It became an archive of unresolved contradictions, each attempt to traverse it resulting in reinterpretations that never aligned with origin or destination. Entire demon legions dissolved into competing narratives of their own existence, unable to confirm whether they had ever been singular. On Ver9, the Crimson Pilgrims' remaining presence disintegrated into doctrinal stasis. Their sacred hymns, once weapons of dissent, no longer propagated, not silenced, untransmittable. Their belief structures collapsed inward not from defeat, but from inability to sustain agreement on what belief was meant to produce. The cathedrals of the infinite flesh ceased expansion entirely, their living architecture no longer distinguishing worship from structure. They simply remained, as though awaiting a definition that would never arrive. The Garden of Rotting Stars withdrew its roots from contradiction-heavy regions, not in retreat, but in recognition that nourishment required stable interpretation. Even compassion could not function where suffering had lost definable edges. Its vast organism dimmed into layered stillness across subterranean strata, neither alive nor dormant in any consistent sense. The mirrored god, now dispersed across fractured reflective substrates, attempted one final observation. But observation required separation between observer and observed, and that separation no longer held. Its presence dissolved into static reflection without source, and even that static ceased to be consistent. Marshal Vale finally lowered his weapon. If everything has stopped, what remains? Gojo turned slightly, as though acknowledging not the question, but the space in which questions still attempted to exist. Something that no longer needs to continue, he said. Across Ver Ix, the silence after the stars deepened. Not as absence, but as final exhaustion of systems that had once attempted to define continuation itself. No gods moved, no fleets descended, no cathedrals expanded, no gardens consumed, no mirrors reflected, no archives predicted. Yet nothing had ended. It had only ceased to disagree about whether it was still happening. And within that silence, Gojo Satoru remained the only point where existence still attempted to notice itself without collapsing into contradiction. While beyond him, even the concept of beyond began to lose meaning, slowly, irreversibly, as though the stars themselves had finally forgotten how to conclude their own existence.